أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. Chapter 21 from The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times by Ghani Ganon Sheikh Abdul Wahid Yahya rahimahullah. This chapter is entitled Cain and Abel. This and in the next chapter also on the significance of metallurgy are two of, I think, the most masterful chapters in this book. In terms of how they are illustrations of, again, the theme introduced in chapter 17 of the solidification of the world. They have a profundity of insight and an economy of expression akin to many of the essays in Genon's other masterful work, Symbols of Sacred Science. In this chapter on Cain and Abel, Genon is concerned with the symbolic significance of the Cain-Abel story with respect to the solidification of the world. In other words, what is the significance of Cain slaying Abel as a myth, in the traditional sense of the term, a story of an actual historical event, but with very far-reaching ramifications and symbolism all the way down to our time near the end of the cycle of the Kali Yuga. He opens the chapter by writing, "The solidification of the world has yet other consequences not mentioned hitherto in the human and social order. For it engenders therein a state of affairs in which everything is counted, recorded, and regulated, and this is really only another kind of mechanization." So the Cain and Abel story is symbolic of the solidification of the world in its social effects, its effects on what Genon calls the human and social order. He continues, "It is only too easy nowadays to find typical instances anywhere, such as, for example, the mania for census taking, which is, of course, directly connected with the importance attributed to statistics, and more generally the endless multiplication of administrative interventions in all the circumstances of life. It doesn't matter where you live, there's all sorts of bureaucratic nonsense that impinges on human life. Now it's usually all done through online harassment, email harassment, text harassment." There's an interesting footnote here about census taking and incessant counting. Now, apparently, in pre-modern times, there was a kind of extreme circumspection regarding counting of the sort, in other words, of census taking. Because the more you count, the more that people die, apparently. And he says that there is a kind of folk wisdom among pastoralists and those who practice animal husbandry or those who have herds, that if the animals are counted too often, far more of them die than if they are not counted. And of course, Genon concludes this footnote by saying, "But in the eyes of moderns who call themselves enlightened, such things cannot be anything but superstitious." In this regard, I remember very interesting advice which was imparted to me many, many years ago in Cairo, Egypt. A very good friend of mine, he started out as a mentor, became very good friends for about 30 years, Sheikh Nuruddin Durki, was in the apartment of Abdullah Schleifer, actually, in Champollion, in Cairo. We were talking, and he said, in Nizamuddin, you should never count your money more than once. Now, this was, of course, the days of cash, and in much of the world, cash is still king. And it was always my practice that I would go and I would obtain the full amount of my scholarship. And, then I would just carry it around with me and meet my expenses. So I had very nice living arrangements, so I didn't pay any rent, and so most of the money was spent on food and books. But he said, you should never count your money more than once. And I said, why? And he says, well, the more you count it, the less it will be. And I said, well, how is that? He says, well, it's a question of barakah. But then he told the story, barakah meaning kind of blessing, the blessedness. We talk in our culture also in South Asia about having barakah in your money. That even if you don't make much money, somehow it goes a long way. And all of your needs are somehow met. So there is a qualitative dimension. If you remember the chapter on the degeneration of coinage, there is a qualitative dimension to wealth as well, and the same applies to money. So he told the story about a particular wali who had made some sort of a prayer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for sustenance, and he had this kind of bag, and he would just put his hand in them, and the money he needed would come out. And then one day he counted it. He counted whatever amount was there, and then after that it never happened again. So it's a very interesting story. So I always remember that, and it may sound crazy to many people, but I don't do it. I only count my money once. If I have cash, I only count it once. And then once I've spent it, I don't count it again. And this is also completely counterintuitive to modern people. Of course, now we don't use cash so much, so I do not like to check my bank balance. I don't like to check how much things cost. I really don't. I try not to think about it. So that's a crazy way of doing things for most modern people. But, there's something to it. All right, so I thought that was an interesting footnote. So to return to the theme, the symbolic significance of the Cain and Abel story. So the Cain and Abel story, where is that? It's in, if we talk about it from the biblical point of view, it's in the book of Genesis. It's Genesis 4. And the verse in question is verse 9, the King James Version. And the Lord said unto Cain, where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? There is a very interesting essay by A.K. Kumaraswamy entitled, Am I my brother's keeper? It appears in more than one published form. The form I know it in is a book entitled The Bugbear of Literacy. It's the first chapter. Can you hand me my laptop? I think I have it saved there. I think it's relevant to read that out. Thank you. Yes. Here it is. Yes, indeed. Am I my brother's keeper? Kumaraswamy says, Cain, who killed his brother Abel, the herdsman, and built himself a city, prefigures modern civilization. Now, I can't help but think that Genon may have had this essay in his mind. Is it possible? This book was published in 1946. But I'm sure that this essay is probably before that, and Reign of Quantity comes out in 1945. But even if he didn't have this essay directly in his mind, or exactly this essay, the concept is the same. So Cain symbolizes the city. Now you have to understand that in the context of the solidification of the world, the city is solidification. The city is time. The city is fixation. And Abel is the herdsman. He is the pastoral nomad, a nomadic pastoralist. That's space, it's freedom, it's movement. So Cain, says Kumaraswamy, who killed his brother Abel, the herdsman, and built himself a city, prefigures modern civilization. One that has been described from within as a murderous machine, with no conscience and no ideals. He's quoting people. You can get the book and look at the footnotes. He goes on, he says, neither human nor normal nor Christian, and in fact an anomaly, not to say a monstrosity. That's a third quote. It has been said the values of life are slowly ebbing. There remains the show of civilization without any of its realities. A fourth quote. Criticisms such as these, continues Kumaraswamy, could be cited without end. Modern civilization, by its divorce from any principle, can be likened to a headless corpse of which the last motions are convulsive and insignificant. It is not, however, of suicide, but of murder that we propose to speak. It's a brilliant, brilliant opening. And you can read that, you can find that, as a PDF online, and you can read that whole essay for yourself. But this is what is at work here. In the Quran, the story is told in the 5th surah, which is Surah Al-Ma'idah, in verses 27 to 31. I'm not going to read them just to save time, but I'll just paraphrase the story. It's essentially the same as what we have in the biblical account in Genesis. You have Cain, you have Abel. Cain is an agriculturalist. Abel is a pastor, is a herdsman. So they offer some sacrifices to God. Abel sacrifices animal. It's an animal sacrifice. Cain offers agricultural or vegetable, so to speak, sacrifice. Cain's sacrifice is not accepted. Abel's sacrifice is accepted. He's upset. He's jealous of his brother, and he is going to kill him. And Abel says that I will not raise my hand against you, so to speak, if you raise your against me to kill me. And so he kills him. Then in the Quran story, a bird, what's called a ghurab, I believe a ghurab would be a grouse, Grouse, comes and actually covers the corpse of another bird, I think it is. And then, how is it in English? Cain then realizes he needs to bury his brother. He buries his brother, and then it is for this reason, it says in the Quran, that the children of Israel, it was said to them that that murder is this great sin, and killing one human being is like the killing of all of humanity, etc., etc., etc. But Genon is concerned with the symbolism here, and there's a deep and profound symbolism. So he begins with this whole notion of quantification, census taking, and so forth. So what's the relevance of census taking aside from that footnote that the more you count people or living things, they die? He says that interventions of this kind, in other words, interventions by the state or authority, for example, in terms of counting things like a census, says these interventions must naturally have the effect of ensuring the most complete uniformity possible between individuals, all the more so because it is almost a principle of all modern administration to treat individuals as mere numerical units all exactly alike. That is to act as if by hypothesis. The ideal of uniformity had already been realized, thus constraining all men to adjust themselves, so to speak, to the same average level. So this concept of the census is another example of quantity and the hegemony of quantity, where everybody is just reduced to numbers. In another aspect, and this continues then on to page 145, this ever more inordinate regulation has a highly paradoxical consequence. And it is this: the growing rapidity and ease of communication between the most distant countries, thanks to the inventions of modern industry, are matters of pride. Yet at the same time, every possible obstacle is put in the way of the freedom of these communications, to the extent that it is often practically impossible to get from one country to another. If you don't have the passport of certain privileged nations, it's very, very difficult to cross borders. And even if you have that passport, it's very expensive. Then there are certain places which are off limits. If you have a U.S. passport, try going to Iran. If you have an Indian passport, try going to Pakistan. If you have a Pakistani passport, try going to India. If you live on the West Bank, if you live in Ramallah, try going to Al-Quds. So this is another demonic dimension of solidification. These introduction of these fake borders. I mean, honestly, it was easier to travel throughout the Ottoman Empire in the pre-modern period. than it is to move almost anywhere today. And it's not just visas and this. There's all of this security theater and nonsense at every airport that you have to suffer through because of this whole fake 9/11 nonsense and all sort of other securitization of the population, securitization especially of Muslims. Anyhow, these are all dimensions of solidification. But the fact which he wants to focus on here, or the dimension that Genon wants to focus on here in terms of the Cain and Abel story is, and I quote on page 145, "This is another special aspect of solidification. In such a world, there is no longer any room for nomadic peoples such as formerly survived in various circumstances." In other words, these are the nomads symbolized by Abel. So, Cain and Abel. So that's in Arabic, it's Qabil and Habil. But in the Quran, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, it just refers to the two sons of Adam. Qabil is the firstborn, Habil is the secondborn. Qabil is an agriculturalist, he's a farmer. Habil is a shepherd, he is nomadic. Nomads follow the lunar calendar. Sedentary peoples tend to follow the solar calendar. Sedentary people are deeply immersed in time. Nomadic people, they're sort of dispersed in space. He will come back to all this very, very, very soon. He will go into all this in more detail very soon. So, yeah. So he says, these people, in other words, the nomads, gradually come to a point at which they no longer find in front of them any free space. And in addition to this, all possible means are used to cause them to adopt a sedentary life. So that in this connection, also the time seems not to be far distant when the wheel will stop turning. While in addition, within the sedentary life, the towns representing something like the final degree of fixation take on an overwhelming importance and tend more and more to absorb everything else. This is how it comes about that toward the end of the cycle, Cain really and finally slays Abel. I think that's a very interesting observation. So then he goes on to elaborate what I've already said, that Cain in biblical symbolism is a farmer. Abel, he says, is a stockmaster. But they symbolize for Genon the two types or sorts of peoples who have existed since the origins of the present humanity, the humanity of this cycle, the Kali Yuga. He calls this since the time of the earliest differentiation. In other words, between the sedentary, devoted to cultivation of the soil, and the nomads, devoted to raising of flocks and herds. It must be emphasized, he says at the bottom of 145, that these two occupations are essential and primordial in the two human types. Anything else is only accidental, derived, or superadded. So Cain and Abel, Habil and Qabil also symbolize these two fundamental human types. Each of these two categories, the sedentary and the nomadic, he means, naturally had its own traditional law. The nature of its occupations, had its own traditional law, different from that of the other, and adapted to its way of life and the nature of its occupations. This difference was particularly apparent in the sacrificial rites. Remember I said Cain sacrificed, he made plant offerings, vegetable, agricultural offerings, and Abel gave animal offerings, according to Genesis. And also he says, as biblical symbolism in particular is now being considered, it is as well to note at once in that connection that the Hebrew Torah belongs properly to the type of law appropriate to nomadic peoples. Hence the way in which the story of Cain and Abel is presented, for it would appear in a different light in the eyes of a sedentary people, and would be susceptible of a different interpretation. Although the aspects corresponding to the 2 points of view are, of course, both included in the profound meaning of the story. This is what Genon calls the double meaning of symbols. And this comes up a lot in his writing. About halfway down on page 147, he talks about the agricultural peoples and their sedentary nature. He says the agricultural peoples, just because they are sedentary, are naturally those who arrive sooner or later at the building of towns, So in other words, the sedentary people, those symbolized by Cain, are actually agents of solidification. Indeed, it is said that the first town was founded by Cain himself. Moreover, its foundation did not take place till well after the time during which he is said to have been occupied in agriculture. Which shows clearly that there are, as it were, two successive phases in sedentarism. The second representing a relatively more pronounced degree of fixity and spatial constriction than the first. It could be said in a general way that the works of sedentary peoples are works of time. Very interesting observation. These peoples are fixed in space within a strictly limited domain and develop their activities in a temporal continuity that appears to them to be indefinite. That's why in sedentary civilizations you typically have a solar calendar. You have to be in one place, make observations, and solar calendar is central to agriculture. So the Muslims use a lunar calendar because of the nomadic origins of the Arab people, and that's for all their religious things. But if you go to Muslim countries like Egypt, where they have to plant, they have a separate agricultural calendar. It's the old Egyptian calendar, now the Coptic calendar, that farmers use there. And similarly in India, if you're a Muslim landowner or back in the day, then you would have followed the Hindu calendar for planting. And then later, of course, the British introduced the Christian calendar. Anyway, so on the other hand, nomadic and pastoral peoples build nothing durable and do not work for a future that escapes them, but they have space before them, not facing them with any limitation. If you go out into the desert, what are you immediately confronted by? An endless expanse of space. But on the contrary, always offering them new possibilities. No limitation. In this way is revealed the correspondence of the cosmic principles, to which, in another order, the symbolism of Cain and Abel is related. In other words, he has in mind the principle of compression, represented by time, and the principle of expansion, represented by space. So expansion and compression are two principles, but they're not independent. They're polarities, or they're concomitants of one another, and they're manifested simultaneously in time and in space, as in everything else. In time, as in space, as in everything else, it is necessary to point this out in order to avoid unduly simplified identifications or assimilations. So the action of the principle of compression predominates in the temporal condition, and that of expansion in the spatial condition. Moreover, time uses up space, if it may be put so, and correspondingly, in the course of the ages, the sedentary peoples, time uses up space, remember? The sedentary peoples gradually absorb the nomadic peoples. This gives, as indicated above, another significance to Cain and Abel. In other words, a social and historical significance to the murder of Abel by Cain. Nomads direct their activities particularly to the animal kingdom. They take care of their herds, their flocks, their camels, their what have you. But sedentary peoples, on the other hand, they're non-mobile, and so they're concerned with the vegetable and the mineral. In other words, farming and mining, metallurgy. Again, this is interesting. This will come up in the next chapter. Footnote 9 is interesting. He talks about how the use of mineral elements includes more specifically building and metallurgy. Biblical symbolism, he says, attributes the origin of metallurgy to someone named Tubal-Cain. In other words, a direct descendant of Cain. And Cain's very name reappears in that biblical name of Tubal followed by Cain. That's interesting. So he will have more to say about minerals and metallurgy and metals in the next chapter, chapter 22. He also tells us that it's in the nature of things that sedentary populations should be more inclined in their symbolism, their religious symbolism, to visual iconography and visual symbols, images made up of various substances. In the Hindu context, this would be what is called the yantar or the yantra, whereas rather than being concerned with this geometrical viewpoint, the nomadic peoples make sonorous symbols or symbols of sound, which is compatible with their state of continual wandering and migration. So it's interesting that the Quran is a sonorous symbol. The arts of singing, poetry recitation, prosody, all of these kinds of things. And the sedentary peoples create things like architecture, sculpture, painting, what are known as the plastic arts. The arts consisting of forms developed in space. Nomads create phonetic arts, as I just said, music, poetry, prosody, so forth. Because these arts unfold in time. All art for Genon is in its origin essentially symbolic and ritual, and it's only in modern times due to solidification that we have a degeneration and art just becomes a kind of profane recreation and manifestation of the nafs, or the baser self of the artists. On page 149, about halfway down, second paragraph. Thus, the complementarism of the conditions of existence is manifested in the following way. Those who work for time are stabilized in space. Those are the sedentaries, symbolized by Cain. Those who wander in space are ceaselessly modified within time, the nomads, those symbolized by Abel. And the antinomy of the inverse sense appears as follows. Those who live according to time, the changing and destroying element, fix and conserve themselves. Those who live according to space, the fixed and permanent element, disperse themselves and change unceasingly. This must be so, in order that the existence of each may remain possible. For in this way, at least a relative equilibrium is established. So, Genon is not really against the one or the other. He says there has to be an equilibrium between what is symbolized by Cain and Abel, what is symbolized by the sedentary and the nomadic, the compressive and the expansive. So these compressive and expansive tendencies have to be in some state of equilibrium. Otherwise, they would end in either the extreme of crystallization, sedentary, or volatilization, nomadic, or coagulation and solution, to take the alchemical symbolism. And these, indeed, again, are connected with the duality of heaven and earth, introduced in the previous chapter, in which you have man, universal man, the grand triad, another book by Genon, and of course with the whole central metaphysical concept in the whole book, Reign of Quantity, is Purusha and Prakriti, or essence and substance, which are basic principles, basic to all manifestation. Page 150, second paragraph, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down. To return to biblical symbolism, the animal sacrifice is fatal to Abel, and the vegetable offering of Cain was not accepted. He who is blessed dies. He who lives is accursed. Equilibrium is thus broken on both sides. How can it be reestablished except by exchanges such that each has its part in the production of the other? Thus it is that movement brings together time and space, being in a way resultant of their combination, and reconciles in them the two opposed tendencies just mentioned. Movement itself is moreover only a series of disequilibria, but the sum of these constitutes a relative equilibrium compatible with the law of manifestation or of becoming. That is to say, with contingent existence itself. This is a beautiful, beautiful passage. It continues, every exchange between beings, subject to spatial and temporal conditions, is in effect a movement. This is some of the most profound, really, observations on the true sort of understanding of social relations or social life. Every exchange between beings, subject to spatial and temporal conditions, is in effect a movement, or rather, a combination of two inverse and reciprocal movements which harmonize and compensate one another. In this case, equilibrium is realized directly by virtue of the fact, we're on page 151 now, that this compensation exists. Footnote 16. Equilibrium, harmony, and justice are really but three forms or aspects of one and the same thing. They could even in a certain sense be brought respectively into correspondence with the three domains shortly to be referred to, on condition, of course, that justice be taken in its most immediate meaning, of which in the modern world mere honesty in commercial transactions represents an expression, diminished and degraded by the reduction of all things to the profane point of view and the narrow banality of ordinary life. To return to the main text. The alternating movement of the exchange may impinge on three domains, alluded to in the footnote. Spiritual, or pure intellectual. The second is psychic, and the third is corporeal, corresponding to the three worlds, the exchange of principles, of symbols, and of offerings. Such is the triple foundation in the true traditional history of terrestrial humanity, on which rests the mystery of pacts, alliances, and benedictions, basically equivalent to the sharing out of the spiritual influences at work in our world. Oddly enough, I just remembered the Surah Quraysh, Li Ilafi Quraysh, the pacts of the ancient Quraysh, in terms of their summer and winter trade. In the true traditional history of terrestrial humanity, on which rests the mystery of pacts, alliances, and benedictions, basically equivalent to the sharing out of the spiritual influences at work in our world. But these last considerations cannot be dwelt on, for they obviously belong to a normal state of affairs from which we are now very far removed in all respects, a state of which the modern world as such is in truth no more than the simple and direct negation. And that concludes the chapter. It's really beautiful, and I think this shows just how deep and profound the sacred stories are in scriptures, particularly the Quran, but other scriptures as well, although they have been abrogated by Islam and the Quran and the message of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, he talks about these pacts and so forth, and he has an interesting footnote here on money again, which I would like to draw your attention to. In the chapter called The Degeneration of Coinage, which was chapter 16, he talks about the direct intervention of the spiritual authority in the monetary domain. He specifically referred to the Druids and the Celts. But here, again, this has to do with pacts and alliances. Money is also something which is agreed upon. There are certain conventions. But these were in previous times of a sacred character. So he says that the involvement of spiritual authority in the matter of money in traditional civilizations is directly connected with what has just been said in this paragraph. Indeed, he says, money itself is in a certain sense the very embodiment of exchange. Remember, he's talking about exchanges between people, particularly sedentary and nomadic. Hence, a much more exact idea can be formed of the real purpose of the symbols that it bore, and that therefore circulated with it, for they gave to exchange a significance quite other than is contained in its mere materiality, though this last is all that it retains under the profane conditions that govern the relations of peoples no less than those of individuals in the modern world. So there is much more involved in traditional societies and in places where some semblance of sacred orders still exists, even if on a very residual level. It's not just a monetary exchange. There is an actual, genuine give and take in a human relationship which is involved. And of course, much of this, or most of it in the modern world, is now completely and totally gone and has been obliterated, and represents, according to Genon and his interpretation of this ancient story, it constitutes the final slaying by Cain of Abel. Think about that. Thank you very much for watching.